Evolve or perish. Chapter 7. Use of gross income. A little straight thinking will reveal that many corporation practices which are inconsistent with ethical principles. These practices involve the manner of use of the gross income and the diversion of parts of this income for purposes for which it should not be used. We will assume that all practices indulged in are entirely legal under the statutes of every state in the Union and all federal enactments, and that stockholders, directors, and management are not breaking any statute laws. This, however, does not eliminate the possibility that these practices are, in essence, inconsistent with the principles of common honesty, contrary to the economic welfare of the community, and a distinctly anti-social force. When a corporation is organized, a number of shares of stock are sold. The money received becomes the capital of the corporation. There is no justification for more than one kind of shares. The capital is used to purchase land, building, machinery, supplies, and raw materials, and to supply an amount of cash needed as working capital. The stockholders are entitled to earn reasonable dividends on the total amount of invested money used for these purposes. They are entitled to have their capital investment maintained at its original value by constant upkeep and repair, paid for out of gross income before profits, but they are not entitled to anything else from this source. For everything else, they must go to their dividend funds or to new capital obtained through the sale of additional shares of stock. Many expenditures are made by corporations out of gross income before profits, by means of which parts of the gross income are transformed into capital. If the original amount of working capital is increased, without the sale of stock for that purpose, but by transferring to this fund money obtained from gross income, the capital structure has been increased without expense to the stockholders. They got something for nothing. If a new building was erected or additional machinery installed without the cost being paid out of the sale of additional stock, but were paid out of gross income before profits, these items represent capital structure expansion obtained without taking in additional capital. The capital structure is owned by the stockholders, and they receive the monies involved in the purchase of the building and machinery. It was not their money that was used in making purchases, because stockholders have no rights in, nor title to, any monies in the hands of the corporation until some part of it has been set aside as available for dividends. Their stockholders' title is valid only to the monies so set aside as dividends, and after they have been paid to them as the profits to which they are entitled. Since the stockholders do not own the gross income of the corporation, but are merely acting as custodians of monies that are in their hands temporarily, while in transit through the economic circuit, they, acting through their board of directors, have no right to transfix any of it into the capital structure of the corporation beyond such reasonable amount as is properly voted as dividends. Any money so transferred are diverted from some other individuals or agencies associated with the activities of the corporations, the workers who produce the goods sold by the corporation, for example. If the directors or stockholders take from the monies passing through the corporation's hands those amounts that should go to the employees, the act differs in no essential way from an act in which the employees would go to the corporation's treasury and take the cash about to be paid out to the stockholders as dividends. If a corporation increases its capital values, or its assets, in any way without having received the full amount of this capital increase from the sale of stock, the stockholders have received this increase in assets at the expense of someone else. They have taken this money, or its equivalent value, from others without compensation. That is stealing. These increases in assets are transferred in various ways. They can be hidden, for example, in increasing stocks of raw materials or in increasing inventories of finished articles. The erection of a new building, installation of new machinery, or any extension of facilities paid out of current sales income, or any other source than the proceeds from the sale of capital stock, involves the misappropriation of funds. Any expansion of business facilities, such as an enlarged sales force or an enlarged advertising campaign, the enlarged faction of which is not built on increased capital but financed out of current revenues or gross income, involves the misappropriation of funds. Any money taken from gross income and used or set aside for growth, enlargement, expansion of original facilities, or placed in reserve, surplus, or like funds for future use for such purposes, is misappropriated by the stockholders. Such misappropriations are entirely legal, but nevertheless are entirely unethical and totally dishonest. One of the common ways of transferring gross income monies into the capital structure of corporations is through bonds. Bonds are sold to supply money for capital investments to build additional plants, install extensions to facilities, buy new equipment, purchase another organization, or for any one of a vast variety of purposes. The extensions become part of the real assets of the corporation, adding their total amount to the capital structure owned by the stockholders. The interest on the bonds is paid out of the portion of gross income devoted to overhead. The amortization, or paying off, of the bonds is provided for by a sinking fund which is maintained and built up with money taken from gross income. When the bonds have been paid off, the money for this purpose has come entirely out of gross income to the extent of more than twice the face value of the bonds, due to the cost of interest, say 5% for 20 years, and the value received has gone entirely to the stockholders through the increased value of the holdings of the corporation. Stockholders have absolutely no right to touch a single penny of the gross income of corporations to add to their assets or to their capital structure in any way. Yet they dig into the corporation's gross income in blocks of hundreds of thousands and even millions of dollars to pay off bond issues. The only money that is available under principles of common honesty to pay off bond issues or similar obligations and the interest on them is money which has been voted in reasonable amounts as dividends or money which has been brought into the corporation through the sale of stock. Money which has been partitioned from gross income for overhead, sinking funds, reserves, surplus, expansion, etc., is money which is wrongfully taken by stockholders. They hold no title to that money. The money in the gross income of the corporation was received from the economic circuit to pay the producers of the goods for their services and to supply them with the means for purchasing goods equivalent in amount to those they produced. In other words, the money belonged to the people on the payroll, and it was taken by the stockholders for their own benefit. If the stockholders should, after the manner of bank bandits, go to a bank and take $1 million and use it to pay off their bonds, without as much as a thank you to the bank, they would be performing an act which differs in no essential way from their present procedure. The internal misappropriation of funds within corporations, along such lines as indicated, has resulted in the rapid expansion of the capital structure of the corporations. This has brought about a vast increase in wealth for the stockholders, but it has resulted in the impoverishment of other groups in the community. The impoverished groups comprise the workers who have produced the wealth, but who have no voice in the disposition of the gross income of the corporations. The net result of these practices by the corporation executives has been the impoverishment of the country as a whole, by depriving the vast majority of the members of our national community, the employees of these and other corporations, their own and other corporations, of the buying power needed to purchase the goods they produce for sale. This is the direct cause of the depression. It was mentioned previously that the stockholders have no rights in or title to the gross income of corporations, and therefore no authority to administer these funds. This is true, notwithstanding any legalistic dicta to the contrary. The gross income of a corporation is the money received from the sale of goods or services produced by the corporation. It was collected to pay for the costs of producing the goods, and to pay dividends to the stockholders on the capital invested in the means and mechanisms of production. If we allow a fair amount for dividends, then capital is paid its fair wages. The remainder must be used to pay for labor and material used in all departments of production, and for the maintenance but not expansion of producing facilities. All material used, including power, is essentially nothing but labor paid for in another form. In the final analysis, all of the gross income of a corporation should eventually go to pay for labor, except that portion which can properly be allocated to stockholders for return on invested capital. The interests of labor and capital in the gross income of a corporation must be recognized. The ratio of the interests of labor and capital is about 12-1 if we allow an 8% return on investment, and about 16-1 if we allow a 6% return. On the basis of this simple, uninvolved situation, and without regard to any sociological, economical, or political theories, Labor should have this proportional voice in the administration of the gross income. Labor has an absolute property right in the administering of gross income to the extent of 16 units of power to labor to 1 unit of power to capital. As a matter of fact, as long as the agreed rate of return on invested capital is guaranteed, the representation of capital, or the stockholders, on the board administering gross income would be unnecessary but desirable. The foregoing does not contain, by direct statement or by implication, the suggestion that industry should be run on a socialistic or communistic basis. The unavoidable implication is quite the contrary. The average run of workers in industry are entirely incompetent to administer the executive affairs of corporations, and it would be an act of greatest unwisdom to try to get them to do so. Entirely too many workers exhibit abilities which do not fill the areas surrounding their jobs. Administrative work must be performed by persons competent, through inborn qualifications, to shoulder its responsibilities. All administrators, under a rational order of procedure, are primarily responsible to the community as a whole, even though their activities are localized in a particular goods-producing and wage-dispersing group. They can grant no favors to any group at the expense of the community as a whole. They are responsible for their particular group contributing its fair share of productive effort to the economic circuit, and for receiving from the economic circuit, in the form of sales income or gross income, adequate amounts of money to not only compensate the workers for their services, but to maintain the purchasing power of the community at a proper level. Both the community and the individual aspects of every situation must be considered. The interests of the workers in a particular group, or the interests of the community, would not be served by placing in an executive position a man, say a drill press operator, whose competence did not extend beyond this particular activity. To give such a man a voice in executive matters would be a piece of colossal stupidity. And to multiply that stupidity by almost the total number of employees, which would be the case if all workers were given a voice in executive matters, would be a sign of idiocy. To fail to give employees opportunity to apply their abilities in fields in which they are competent would be equally idiotic. Particular individuals possess the qualifications for performing executive and administrative duties. The possession of these qualifications does not necessarily correspond with the possession of capital, and would probably be found to a greater extent outside the ranks of the so-called capitalists. If we are to get down to a sound basis for our economic structure, we must fearlessly and with truth and sincerity examine every part of our present economic structure. This is the road to safety, and any other will lead to ruin and the early destruction of the present structure. Rights and equities must be guaranteed to their rightful possessors, and rights and properties not rightfully possessed must be transferred to their rightful owners. The criteria for judgment as to rightful owners of equities and rights are to be found in fundamental principles of morals and ethics, and not in existing statutory or legalistic dicta on property rights. The unmoral and unethical practices of our corporations, specifically their stockholders, boards of directors, and executives, should not be made the basis for a charge that they are at heart criminals, unmoral and unethical. They are, however, indefensible against a charge of abysmal ignorance concerning the nature of the fundamental mechanisms of the economic circuit. This is equally true of labor. If both sides to the controversies involving capital and labor were interested in arriving at the fundamental truth and establishing a rational philosophy of economics and sociology, instead of fighting with selfish motives, we would have arrived at an economic and social structure much safer and more satisfactory than that which now exists. Capital would not have made some of its most serious errors affecting the community as a whole if it had availed itself of the balancing interests of labor. Neither capital nor labor could be expected to produce this safe and underlying philosophy of industrial relations, but they could have encouraged those who were able to supply this knowledge instead of discouraging them. Discouraging is a mild and very charitable way of describing the attitude of capital. The interests of the community as a whole are associated in every corporation with the interests of the workers, to at least 12 times the extent to which they are associated with the interests of capital. The community has an interest in every corporation which is at least equal to the interest of labor and capital combined, and is entitled to have this ratio of representation in every corporation. It is easy to understand the howl which will be raised among the ignorant element of the capitalists at this suggestion. One need not be a psychologist to understand it. Their fears that the consummation of this piece of simple justice would lead to chaos and the complete destruction of everything which they built are quite unfounded. The workers have 12 units of interest in maintaining the present system in successful operation to every 1 unit of interest that capital has. Even with the present unfair and unsafe participation of labor in the fruits of production, its interests in the present order of things are several times greater than those of capital. The interest of the community in maintaining producing units in successful operation exceeds that of both workers and owners. We must, for the immediate and future safety of our country, establish a new basis of corporation administration. Capital will have to confine its jurisdiction entirely to dividends voted out of gross income. Its jurisdiction over gross income will be limited to a proportional representation equal to the percentage of agreed dividends. Administration of the gross income of each corporation must be in the hands of a board representing the producers on the payroll of the corporation and the community as a whole. The distribution of gross income must be made under rational principles based on the rights of producers to receive the full benefits of their services and the interests of the community in every economic operation. The producers receiving the benefits of their production, to which they are fully entitled but which formerly went to the stockholders, must be prepared to assume the responsibility of supplying additional capital as required, and they will be in a position to do so.